Assalamu alaikum. I am honored to be here. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you so much for having me. Um, Before I begin, it's not customary for me to have both a paper and a laptop. I ran into some technical issues and a few pages did not print, so bear with me in this journey. So I want to begin with gratitude because it's unfair for me to say that this work that I'll be talking about, it's my upcoming book with Harvard University Press, is just my doing. I have to thank hundreds from Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, have had the honor to work with, who have shown generosity beyond which I can, or that which I cannot reciprocate. Great minds and great hearts, particularly because I happen to be in Lahore. I want to extend my thanks to the late Dr. Iqbal Mujaddidi, who is one of the most brilliant, I should have to say, certainly in this part of the world, the most brilliant person that I have encountered. And the way in which he guided my research for a decade and a half, well, I miss him very much. यकीनन फ़ख्र की बात है कि मुझको यहाँ मदऊ किया गया है. Before I start, I'm going to ask a question. How many of you know any historical female Sufi masters, let's say in our backyard? Let's begin with Lahore, or we can extend this to Punjab, or if anyone is from further away, perhaps Peshawar, broader KP. Can I get a show of hands? Yes. Sorry? All right. Yes. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so I am glad several of us are aware that the field I'm about to enter is very rich, and I'm also glad that I'll have a few things to talk about. The truth is they're actually everywhere. In every historical, or let's say almost every other historical graveyard or shrine. I was recently in Islamabad. If you've been to Saidpur, to the hotspot, climb up to the Khizr shrine, and there's a shrine of a female saint who was a khadim there, located there. Just recently in the old city of Peshawar, I discovered a 4-generation long lineage of female teachers and Sufi masters. They ran a maktab as well, a school, where they taught some of the leading scholars of the city in their youth, with a network basically all throughout Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the Kabul Valley. In fact, in the very same trip on the way back, I stopped by in Attak, where there is a vast sacred complex that's dominated by a shrine of a female Sufi saint. So I hope that this talk today can make us aware of some incredible voices, some incredible stories and individuals that have been mostly erased from our collective memories. So let's begin with the next slide. No. Back, please. पीछे कर लीजिए. पीछे कर लीजिए. पीछे आप आगे जा रहे हैं. अच्छा आगे जाए. Acha. All right, it's a little bit on the sort of horizontally stretched side. Um, फिर वो recording में शायद कुछ दिक्कत हो. All right, so thus in written form it is enshrined. So this is Kabul, approximately 1770s. Thus in written form it is enshrined that whosoever from all women and men that seek the path of transcendent God can come to her service and take the path from her. My voice is rebounding. Is this better? Yes. Okay, excellent. All right. These are the final lines of a diploma issued by Khwaja Safiullah, Hazrat Qayyum al-Jahan of Kabul, the premier scholar and Sufi of Afghanistan, Balochistan, and Sindh, to his foremost student and successor, Bibi Sahiba Kalan. Kalan here meaning great, exalted, elder. A diploma which recognized her as the most exalted saint of her age. Next slide, please. Today we're going to meet the subject of this diploma, the remarkable figure, the female scholar and saint, Bibi Sahiba Kalan, who is deemed the first of the inheritors of the most important Sufi network based in Afghanistan and Pakistan, with branches stretching from Western China to Sindh. And incidentally, a couple of members of her family, her nephews, even became kings in Yarkand in Western China in 1864 when there was a revolt against the Qing dynasty. That's another story I deal with elsewhere. Now, I've been working on, or I've been very fortunate to have been working on Sufi networks in this region for about 15 to 20 years. My book, which came out a couple of years ago, Hidden Caliphate, Sufi Saints Beyond the Oxus and the Indus from Harvard, uh, talks about the pivotal role of Sufis in holding the Muslim world together. The book was supposed to be available in Pakistan through Sange Mil. There has been a delay. We've been waiting about a year. Now, did anyone know that in the 18th and 19th centuries, Peshawar and Bukhara were the famous college towns of Asia, that they used to have academic exchanges, that scholars of Sialkot and Wazirabad were in high demand in Bukhara and Samarkand, that the great kings of Central Asia had actually studied Sufism with teachers in Peshawar, that the greatest scholars of Siberia and Western China would come to Bukhara to study with Peshawari scholars throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. By the way, I'm making a shameless pitch here for my first book. If you didn't know this and were curious, please read my book. It's about the intimate intellectual and spiritual cultural connections between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Now, this particular talk, as I said, is about my upcoming book, which is on female leadership in the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi order. So we'll begin by setting the stage, entering into the rich world of Sufism in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the 18th and 19th centuries. Then we'll introduce Bibi Sahiba and her career, and together follow her journey into the Afghan heartlands and onwards to the holy sanctuaries of Makkah and Medina, and then the sacred epicenters of Central Asia where her story draws to a close. At the end, we'll talk a little bit about her legacy, about the others that came after her. Now, ultimately, what makes this story so fascinating to me is that she and other women of her time were considered paragons of Islamic orthodoxy. They weren't rebels or outsiders. They weren't trailblazers. They were strict on matters of sunnah while being publicly engaged, practical spiritual leaders. And all of this was being done within the norms of strict parda, strict gender segregation. So why does Bibi Sahiba matter? First, we're going to witness through Bibi Sahiba the existence of a potent form of female leadership in the geographic belt comprising especially Afghanistan, the Peshawar Valley, Sindh, and Central Asia. Now, we kind of know that women were active in the religious scholastic spheres in this part of the world, and how do we know this? We know this through scattered references in the sources. For those who've worked on this in the Arabic and Persian sources especially, such and such pir had appointed such and such person as a khalifa. Generally, that's about it. It's remarkable if you ever get even a few lines of an ijazatnama. But we also know this through scattered reference, through lots and lots of shrines. But they generally receive very little attention because the data just isn't there. So I'm going to give all of you a challenge. Next time you happen to see a female shrine, go up to the khadim and ask them who this person is. And I guarantee you, you're going to get a combination of the following. Namaz ki paband, parhezgar, sakhavat, tahajjud ki namazein ada karti thi, sakhi thi, parhezgar thi, pardedar thi, and then the story generally stops. And then often they get bizarre. Often she's chaste. Sometimes she gets swallowed up by the ground to preserve her chastity, and the story stops. This you're going to find, by the way, in Tirmiz, and you're going to find this in Punjab. And the colonial sources, God forbid, would they ever acknowledge female religious leaders. And I'm going to give you a very stark example. Who here knows Richard Burton? The great Richard Burton we enjoy reading. He mentions a female Sufi saint of his time in Sindh, who happens to also belong to the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi order of Bibi Sahiba, who we'll meet soon. And he says nothing except, Astaghfirullah, that she must have been sexually promiscuous. In other words, the only way that the simpleton could make sense of a woman in authority was by degrading her and, of course, sexualizing her. Now, this makes sense. Victorian mores of idealized behavior of women, which all of us in this room have inherited to some degree, did not leave room for a woman who could assert herself, especially in a traditional setting. And that's the big reason why many of us have never heard of Muslim female Sufi masters. It's not in our inherited logic, we're not looking in the right places. It requires looking a little bit outside the comfort zones. Next slide, please. Um, no, you've missed a few slides. Back, please. Yes, this is the one. Perfect. Now, about 10 years ago, when I was traveling from Kabul to Mazar-e-Sharif, I found a book, 450 pages in length in Persian and Arabic, which to my surprise contained one of the most complete biographical accounts of a female scholar saint in the early modern period. And this is how I met Bibi Sahiba. It was a chance encounter that blew my mind. I wasn't expecting to write this book. Now, as it turns out that this book that you're looking at, the principal biography of Bibi Sahiba's Sufi lineage, was composed by her son only 14 years after her death. He was at once her cherished son, her travel companion, her confidant, and her disciple. So he could furnish intimate details about her mother's life and her career, even capturing her emotional state in formative moments of her life. Her voice was thus preserved. Okay, I apologize for the sort of sounds in the background. Then, as I traveled, more sources kept pouring in, and I kept following the leads. Next slide, please. Yes, excellent. Um, in Matiari in Sindh, north of Hyderabad, I finally discovered her daughter's shrine and met several of her descendants, many are of course across Afghanistan, who graciously shared with me their manuscripts. Next slide, please. And afterwards, I was able to collect oral histories and books in nearly 20 towns, or I should say about closer to 20 towns, as far as Tharparkar, where her descendants and followers had settled, in the process discovering about 15 other major female Sufi masters connected to her Sufi tariqa, with huge followings. And here I'm not talking about a woman with 5 sahelis sitting around doing dhikr with no disrespect intended. We're talking about disciples in the thousands. We are talking about spiritual political powerhouses. So this is all very fresh. Next slide, please. Um, a few months ago, I got a WhatsApp message from Kandahar. A gentleman sends me my picture with a green circle around it, and he says, "Is this you?" And then afterwards, he sends me his picture, and he mentions that he's heard about me and he's heard about my research. And it turns out that his family presides over Bibi Sahiba's family shrine in Kandahar, where her son and her husband are buried. And he informed me that he's got many documents they'd like to share with me, and within a few weeks, I get a whole PDF of a new biographical dictionary from Kandahar that I had never seen before. Now, it's vital to note that this story is not just about Bibi Sahiba. It points to a much larger story of hundreds of such contemporary women who are marginalized in the sources. It provides context for many female leaders in Central and Southern Asia, the ones whose shrines dot the landscape, but whose stories are silent. This story also uncovers the intellectual cultural scene of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which, to be very frank, have been treated like civilizational trash heaps in the global media. Um, if more of us knew, for example, that the governor of Kabul under Akbar was a woman, Bakhtun Nisa, who was sent there to quell a rebellion, and also the governor of Kabul and Peshawar under Aurangzeb, Sahibji, also a woman, the story would be a little easier to digest. or that a little closer to home here, well, actually, it's about equidistant. The kingdom of Las Bela and Balochistan in its golden age was ruled by a female queen. It's subject of an article that I'm in the process of writing. Next slide, please. Now, I think we've skipped a slide. It was a slide with a map. Okay, great. It's a slide with a map. एक नक्शा इस पे नजर आएगा आपको. I'll start talking as the. Okay. चलिए. All right. So our story actually begins in Afghanistan and Pakistan and spills into India and Uzbekistan and into the Arabian Peninsula. In the 1750s, a new Durrani empire grew up around three capital cities. We don't really need a map for this. I'm sure all of us are familiar. Kandahar, Kabul, and of course, Peshawar. At its height, it stretched from Iran all the way to North India with a tentative hold over Central Asia. Now, this is the map exactly. Now, at this stage, you've got students, artists, and scholars from China to Istanbul who start coming to these three towns. They become cosmopolitan cities. They host dozens of major colleges and vibrant Jewish, Armenian, Christian, Hindu, Sikh, Shia, and Sunni populations. Can you please make this the full one? ये आप दबा दीजिए. खैर, you're all भाईजान आपने यार ये slides आपने अच्छा या तो मैं ही कर लूं अगर आप बेहतर समझें आप ये ऐड तो नहीं होना चाहिए ना. Are you all still following me? Okay, great. We'll figure this out, and thank you so much for um, all of your patience. I realize we're having technical problems. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about Sufism. We can maybe do this a bit without the slide. I see I'm in front of a very educated audience. Now, Sufism is, of course, the mystical core of Islam. It was an actual science of inner purification and eliminating the nafs, the lower, the ego self, through rigorous practices, through meditation, dhikr, muraqabah, seclusion, ethical conduct, social service, and of course in many traditions, sacred movement and music. Now, Sufi teachings, this is a 101, I apologize if I'm insulting your intelligence. They had distinct schools which are called tariqa, which is called a tariqa, turuq being the plural. It's a path, and each one of them have their own methods of meditation, their own philosophies, their own practices. Now, by the 11th century, the Sufi path was synthesized with all of the other core Islamic sciences, like law, theology, astronomy, philosophy, rhetoric, grammar, so on and so forth. So the most important take-home here is that from very early on, Sufism was an integral component of orthodox traditional Islam, a companion to Islamic law. So law regulates the outer life, tasawwuf regulates the inner life. There's a logic to this. If I happen to be a faqih, a lawyer, and I don't perform the meditative practices necessary to become self-aware, I will probably become a blood-sucking lawyer, like most lawyers today. Likewise, if I am a Sufi who has just studied tasawwuf without being bound by the strictures of Sharia, and here we're not talking about modern concepts of Sharia law, we're talking about Sharia as indecent good behavior, then I'm likely to become a cult leader like many Sufis today. So this, of course, is very different from a popular perception that Sufis are these free spirits marginalized outside of orthodoxy. No, practicing Sufism was no joke. I see I have an orchestra to back me up in this particular talk. Shelly, you're all still following me, right? Okay, as long as we're all in this together. This means that in Bibi Sahiba's Kabul or Peshawar or Lahore, you could not be a religious scholar unless you were practicing Sufi, My nafs is clearly being tested. Um, and you couldn't really be a Sufi without being a religious scholar. Now, again, this is very difficult for a lot of Muslims today to comprehend. We're so divorced from our tradition that we don't realize that about 2 generations ago, all of our families had some affiliation with a Sufi tariqah. And Sufism provided the moral framework in which our society operated. The Sufi centers provided the soup kitchens, lodging for the poor and the travelers, health services, in other words, the core social services. So if you're living in, let's say, 18th century Kabul and Peshawar and you wanted to be a scholar, what would you do? So you'd begin with the maktab curriculum. This is elementary school. Then you'd move on to a madrasa. This is somewhere between high school and college. You'd study law, poetics, grammar, medicine, philosophy, so on and so forth. And then you'd move on to the PhD program, which is the Sufi Center, where you'd begin the inner sciences. Now, now I need the slide, please. So, um, in addition to this, I'm going to add another institution called the Haram Sarai, a female-led institution within the Sufi Center, illuminated uniquely by this study. और अब जरा ये करिए कि जो आप ये लगा रहे हैं तो इसको स्क्रीन उसके लगाएं क्योंकि सब डॉक्यूमेंट्स पे नजर आ जाते हैं तो the story hasn't begun yet, so we can still kind of do this in a kind of choppy way. No, no, not at all. This is part and parcel of the nature of my work is that occasionally someone tells you to go to a village and you're traveling 200 miles and you end up meeting someone and the document you're looking for is not there. And occasionally you lose your way 200 miles in the other direction, you find what you're looking for. So one is quite used to this. Okay, so as they're pulling this up, I will try to continue this. Um, so by the 18th century, the Sufi path, the mystical journey, is down to a science, with teachers' handbooks, stages of mystical growth, literally step-by-step guidelines on becoming enlightened. Now, each Sufi path expands through the appointment of a khalifa, khulafa in plural, and what is a khalifa? You have a promising student, and then that person leads a new community or sets up a new center. Okay, great. Next slide, please. Next. 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 Back. To the bird one. Although this is not what I'm talking about, but this will do the trick. Now, Bibi Sahiba belonged to the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sufi tariqa. So I'm introducing a term here, and once again, if I can have a show of hands, who here is familiar with the Mujaddidi or the Naqshbandi tariqa? Okay, great. Some who are familiar who are not raising their hands. What are some of its defining features? It is the most expansive network in the Muslim world before the 20th century, Indonesia to Bosnia. Let's say it begins, which obviously it begins in dawn of time as Naqshbandis will. So it's highly developed in Central Asia, then it moves to North India. They are Sunnis and they venerate the Imams. By the way, this is Sunni orthodoxy prior to the rise of Wahhabism. They had very sophisticated and scientific methods of inner purification grounded in the Quran and Sunnah. With specific meditations and breathing practices, you could actually enliven these metaphysical centers on your body, each one affiliated with a color, a prophetic flavor, we can say, and with certain experiences with Each one can be used to actually eliminate certain negative ego traits. And what you do is you'd enliven these, let's say they're almost like antennae that are located on our metaphysical body. And through this, once all of them are enlivened, we begin a multi stage of travel. This is Sero Suluk. Now, for those who may not know, this was Orthodox Islamic practice. Everyone from the great Al-Ghazali to the founders of Deoband Madrasa are writing on this. We've got thousands of volumes, everyone from the peasant to the Ottoman king to the Mughal princesses. In this case, Roshanara was actually Majaz. She had a license in the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi order, and I have the letters to prove it, are all practicing this, believe it or not. Orthodoxy was not Saudi Arabia. The fun fact, this is a shout out to my book, Hidden Caliphate, Wahhabis were considered heretics. This is chapter 4 of my, or chapter 5 of Hidden Caliphate. And another point, the point here is not to achieve some sort of ecstasy, union with God, or become mast, but to become a servant of God and God's creation, a sober teacher who can guide others, who's practical, engaged, and enlightened, one who is steadfast on Sharia. So everyone with me here? All right, great. So now we'll begin our journey. This is Bibi Sahiba's world. Now, Bibi Sahiba's Pir, Khwaja Safiullah, was the most renowned Sufi scholar of the Durrani Empire. In the 1770s, he set up a college in a place called Shor Bazar, in the center of the city, drawing students from as far as Balochistan and Bajor to the Pamir Mountains. The greatest, in fact, scholar of, or poet of Badakhshan was one of them. Now, as an aside, by the way, this is the time when one of Kabul's greatest poet, who wrote a several hundred-page divan, was Aisha Durrani, whose work was, incidentally, the first lithograph ever published in Afghanistan in the latter 19th century. Now, Khwaja Safiullah Hazrat Qayyum al-Jahan was revered by two Afghan kings. In 1793, the king, Shah Zaman, actually walked on foot from Kabul's royal fort to the alleyways of Shor Bazar so that Khwaja Safiullah would perform his dastar bandi. This is his coronation ceremony. Can I have the next slide, please? This is Shor Bazar. Next slide, please. Now, Khwaja Safiullah appointed about 30 deputies to manage his sacred scholastic network, which extended from Central Asia to the Kabul highlands and the Pakhtun tribal regions to Balochistan and Sindh. Now, his khalifas included the top scholars of the time. Just in Sindh alone, Makhdoom Ibrahim Tatvi, this is Makhdoom Hashim's grandson, who wrote over 30 works in Arabic, Persian, and Sindhi on meditation, on poetry, law, metaphysics, you name it, is said to have initiated 200,000 Sufis in his broader network from Thatta to Gujarat. Qazi Muhammad and Abdullah Nasarpuri, if anyone's had the pleasure of going to Nasarpur, the most famous family of judges of Sindh. Abdul Wahid Sivistani from Sevan. He was unquestionably the most influential jurist of Sindh. You're going to find his magnum opus, the Biaz-e-Wahidi. It's about yay thick, trilingual. This is on legal opinion and method, and this used to be kept in every single madrasa in Sindh until the 20th century. Next slide, please. So among all of these larger-than-life khulafa, the Khalifa-e-Awwal, the first, was Bibi Sahiba Kalan. In the biographies, she's described as the first and the most perfect and the great deputy. Now, Bibi Sahiba was probably born in Peshawar in 1752 and hailed from a scholarly, saintly family of Sayyids, originally from Bukhara in Uzbekistan. Next slide, please. If you've ever been to Uj Sharif, this is her ancestral home. And as a side note, it's interesting to note that her great aunt, 300 years earlier, was a female saint, Bibi Jaiwindi. There's a dear friend of mine who's just found 10 different biographical entries on Bibi Jaiwindi, and guess what all of them say? Sakhi Parhezgar. And that's it. And then we find the name of a king of Khorasan that's been garbled who actually financed the tomb, someone called Dilshad, who doesn't really exist. But the shrine tells us that there's something going on here. She's obviously a noteworthy figure. Next slide, please. Now, at an early age in Peshawar, Bibi Sahiba memorized the Quran, studied Islamic law, theology, and Greco Arabic medicine, and before the age of 11, in fact, at age 7, she actually is initiated into the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi path, which is very early. The college in Peshawar that she grew up in was a spectacular place. There were many acres of land, gardens, courtyards. All that's left now is a little garden shrine in the middle of Shobha Bazaar. Any Peshawaris here who know Shobha Bazaar, what it's famous for? Yes, the stolen auto parts market of Peshawar. You have to walk through alleyways of clanging metal and grease, and then this little serene garden shrine emerges out of nowhere. It's really quite an experience. Anyway, back when Bibi Sahiba was there were so many women at the Sufi center that nearby scholars even registered a complaint. I can tell the story later if you're interested. In 1769, she married a distant relative about 4 or 5 years her younger, and her husband also became a reputed Sufi and poet. Next slide, please. In the 1770s, Bibi Sahiba arrived in Kabul and Kandahar. In fact, she got married when she was there. She's already a promising young scholar in her 20s. Husband and wife often lived apart. Her husband was often on the road. She managed two Sufi centers, primarily the one in Kabul, while pursuing her own training. And what you're seeing here, by the way, is a 1840s representation of the Kandahari institution. This is the shrine of Hazrat Kandahari. There are about 16 Barakzai princes who are buried here. It's the second most important shrine in Kandahar. Now, over the next 2 decades, she educated hundreds of scholars and Sufis. She was financially independent, and she and her husband inherited about 4,000 acres of land around Kandahar, which the governors had granted for her scholastic endeavors. The oral histories will tell us that about 1,000 of these were transformed into a wildlife preserve where hunted animals would take refuge. This is a very common trope, that Sufis provide refuge for all living beings. Now, the biographical entries, next slide, please, um, allow us to reconstruct the sources and the nature of her authority and what this implied at the day-to-day level. Now, her authority is defined through several titles. We've got the first of the successors, Khalifa Awwal. That's her vis-a-vis her teacher. The Pir, the Sufi master, vis-a-vis her students and the community at large. The second Fatima, Fatima Isani, I will not go into because that is one whole chapter of the next book. Now, the biographical episodes that focus on her teacher, where Bibi Sahiba plays a secondary role, are perhaps the most revealing with regards to her association with him. She's at once the personal confidant, the manager of the affairs of the Sufi center, and a voice of reason. We actually encounter her own voice in these stories and catch glimpses of her day-to-day activities that are unencumbered by all of the tropes of her official entry. So consider this example. In the 1780s, Khwaja Safiullah was in a state of advanced meditation where worldly possessions lost meaning. This is very normal. Now, he had a sizable library of books, and he just ordered that they be donated to the poor. Bibi Sahiba stepped in and decided to preserve the library. The poor, she said, had no need of food. Had no need had need of food, not manuscripts. She purchases all the book with her own money, and then distributes the equivalent amount to the poor to fulfill her teacher's niyyah. And among the books preserved by her is a Quran dated 1211 from Baghdad, which is now sitting with her descendants. This is one among several stories where we learn about her financial independence and wealth through which she carried out a range of charitable activities and building projects. Now, next slide, please. After finishing her training, Khwaja Safiullah issued Bibi Sahiba the 3-page diploma that you saw the end of, indicating that she had mastered the Sharia and designating her as the greatest saint of the age. She's the Qayyumah, and assigning all of his thousands of disciples, male and female, to her charge. It's an incredible document on which I can speak at length. Among its noteworthy points are its lack of gender specificity. Within this document, she becomes the Pir, the master. What does this mean? So she's directing women's meditation, actually also men's meditation, imparting literacy through the Quran, even providing advice on hygiene and health where required, giving lectures on hadith, jurisprudence, and Sufism to more advanced students, administering medical remedies and faith healing, and what we may today call mental health services. And again, I would love to go into that in detail. It's a universe that opened up through one single point in one of her biographical entries. Now, the sources that tell us that Bibi Sahiba taught men and women from both inside and outside the family, even imparting spiritual guidance to senior deputies of Khwaja Safiullah through a veil or curtain. With the order well established from Sindh to Kabul, she now starts getting delegations from far away. The sources tell us about a story concerning a caravan that arrives at her Sufi center in Kandahar, led by a famous poet and darvish, Ahmad Khan Nizamani, from a tiny village, again I challenge you to find it, called Nimjogot, 4 hours now from Karachi. Bibi Sahiba dispatched her son to receive the guests, and she specifically told her son, who was about 10 years old, to request prayers from him. So the young son goes out and he meets Nizamani, but he's disturbed by his unfamiliar features and his darker complexion, so he turns around and goes back. And then he tells his mother, I didn't ask for prayers. Bibi Sahiba becomes upset, and she tells her son, do not consider his physical appearance, as his heart is as luminous as the full moon. When I approach the court of our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, I see Ahmad Nizamani seated at his feet. We are not rendered this honor. This story affirms her wisdom and spiritual insight, which overcomes racial difference. Now I'm talking just about the practical sides of this. Allows her to provide spiritual oversight over a vast multicultural zone. She can mediate across geographic, cultural, and ethnic difference. And just last year, I finally met Nizamani's family, went to Nimjogot. This is actually a Quran, which he wrote by hand with a Persian translation. Keep in mind, this is coming from Nimjogot, which gives you a sense of the cosmopolitan nature of the world in which we're operating. Um, so his great grandson is a phenomenal poet as well, and a radio personality. In fact, they told me their version of the story, and I even found out what meal Bibi Sahiba served Ahmad Nizamani. Now, the narratives at Kabul and Kandahar and Peshawar and elsewhere bear witness to the development of the Haram Sarai, which is a space of spiritual training presided over by women that exists in parallel to the male-dominated institutions. It's part of the larger complex, essential for the teaching of Sufism. They attract scores of women disciples, and of course, it provides social services and mental health services to women. So Bibi Sahiba administers the Haram Sarai, presides over assemblies, and delivers lectures there. And here's now where I'm dealing with the technological problems on my end. So the Haram Sarai has its own meditation rooms, its own storehouses, its own access to stables, and its parallel system of khairat to both Hindu and Muslim mendicants of Kabul. Next slide, please. Now in 1797, Bibi Sahiba joins her teacher and 315, note the number, companions for a historic Hajj journey through Kandahar, Balochistan, and to the small port of Karachi, to Yemen and beyond. She was accompanied by her daughter, Bibi Sahiba II, who was a young scholar and Sufi in her own right, and her two sons, the elder of whom chronicles the events of the journey. For Bibi Sahiba, this journey was a transformative experience. The trip was full of adventures, sea storms. I've got one account of someone who was there who talks about a swindler boat captain who makes them sit in the sun for a long time. It's a rather colorful journey. On the way there, a tragedy happens, and Khwaja Safiullah is ill and he passes away on the boat. And then he's taken to, next slide please, the port of Hodeidah in Yemen. And at this stage, the spiritual and financial affairs of the Hajj caravan fall to Bibi Sahiba. Before he passes away, by the way, Bibi Sahiba publicly takes on his debts and management of the entire caravan. So for those who know the spiritual implications of this, she then leads the entire caravan, which has people like Ibrahim Tatwi on board, so the finest scholars of the age. And then she goes for Hajj, next slide please, in which she reaches her spiritual heights. Each time she approaches the black stone, a voice calls out to her, Ta'ala ya maqbula, Ta'ala ya mahbuba, Ta'ala ya hindiya. Then she travels to Medina, where, quote, this is now her son, at every step she received new grants. The Prophet appeared to her and presented her with a green robe. Now, in her words, Fatima kissed my forehead and I was drowned in her association. She asked me to be seated in the way in which an honored guest is received. Next slide, please. On the return journey through Sindh, her daughter also fell ill and died in a place called Matyari, a medieval pilgrimage town between Hala and Hyderabad. According to the popular stories that are still recited there, the body was placed on the back of a camel, which then was to decide the burial ground. Bibi Sahiba entered into a state of meditation and determined that Matyari was in fact the Chaukat of Medina. By the way, unbeknownst to many, it's an incredible place with multiple sacred graveyards, supposedly 99. So in Matyari, next slide please, the city of saints, Bibi Sahiba builds a shrine for her daughter and a mosque and a maktab, which remains a local holy site. She then returns to Kandahar and then travels to her spiritual and ancestral home of Sirhind via Lahore. And then on her return, she receives an invitation from none other than Amir Haydar, the king of Bukhara. Next slide, please. So you can sort of see her traveling up. Next slide. Okay, excellent. Now, the incredible thing about this story is that at Amir Haydar's time, there were 80 colleges in Bukhara, and by his grandson's time, 365. They likely spent more of their budget on education than the military. Some people complained about this. Bukhara's king was not just a licensed Sufi guide, was not just a Sufi follower, but actually a licensed Sufi sheikh in the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi order, and his teacher came from Peshawar, who is the subject of my first book. The king was also an academic. He lectured several hours a day on academic topics. In fact, I have a collection of 130 letters between him and his Sufi sheikh, which give you a sense of the intimate relationship between the two. The king's father, who was also a great soldier and empire builder, also trained by the same Peshawari sheikh, used to actually mend his own clothes and earn a living through handicrafts. So perhaps there's a lesson here to be learned. So Bibi Sahiba and her two sons go to Bukhara. Next slide, please. And they join scholarly discussions at the Bukharan court. She performs meditations at the holy shrines. Now, on her way back in 1803, she passes away in Mazar-e Sharif, the spiritual capital of Central Asia. Anyone know who's buried in Mazar-e Sharif? Yes. Exactly, Sayyidina Imam Ali. So both in Najaf and in fact, in the 18th century, 19th century, you'll find documents say, and God only knows best. So with Bibi Sahiba's exalted trans-regional reputation, next slide please, the caretakers of the Mazar actually gave her a saint's funeral. She was given the rare honor of being buried under the second dome of Sayyidina Ali's shrine complex. This is huge. Kings were not given this honor. Now her sons continue the journey home. The elder, Shah Fazlullah, becomes a noteworthy poet and a writer, one of Kandahar's great Sufi personalities. The younger, next slide please, becomes a scholar saint of the highlands north of Kabul and a key mobilizer. I had the pleasure of visiting his shrine about 7, 8 years ago. Next slide, please. He was a mobilizer against British forces when they first invaded Afghanistan in 1839, and in fact was martyred by the British at the hands of a Muslim assassin. So the mother, the two sons, the younger who gets martyred, if the trope makes sense to you. But the story that I'm writing, this by the way is the Sufi center there, next slide please, continues well after Bibi Sahiba's passing away. In the 1880s, a tragedy occurs in Afghanistan. British forces invade again. Bibi Sahiba's grandsons became mujahids, major military mobilizers at famous battles like Mewand. Several family members were martyred fighting. Now, as all of you probably know, they defeated the British, but after retreating, the British planted their own puppet ruler, also signed off by Russia, who starts a bloody purge against the traditional Sunni leadership, the Sufis, the Shia, the Hazaras, the Ismailis, and the pagans of Kafiristan, all on a British imperial stipend. It's a fascinating story. Tragic. So the family migrates at this stage in the 1880s to Sindh, first to the shrine of Bibi Sahiba II in Matyari, and then to other places where they set up madrasas. Now, at this time, next slides, please. A new model of female spiritual authority was emerging in this whole region from Afghanistan to Sindh. The women of Bibi Sahiba's family were all trained scholars and Sufis. Several authored fatwas, legal opinions, like in Tando Saidad. A great example of this is Bibi Sahiba's great-granddaughter, Ammaji. Not Bi Amma, you'll see why this stamp is put on there. Ammaji not only performed all-night meditations, but also worked with Bi Amma, the mother of the Ali brothers, who, by the way, she was part of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi order and considered Ammaji to be a spiritual guide. And they together mobilized the women of Sindh to support the Khilafat movement. In fact, together they gave public speeches. So we're told that Sindh is a major area where money is gathered by women, the famous the jewelry for the Khilafat movement. There's a whole element of this which actually involves the Sufi female sheikhs of Sindh who are mobilizers in between. Now, her son Ghulam Mujaddid was the head of the Khilafat movement in Sindh, and when he was jailed, his mother famously sent him a letter to the effect that if in any way he capitulated to the British, her milk was haram to him. So this is tough love. Next slide, please. Bibi Sahiba's grandsons befriended some great Sufis in the Thar Umarkot region, who they appointed as their Khalifas to spread the order from Thar to Rajasthan. Next slide. And this is what I'm focusing on now, and which took me to Thar for several months last year, where I discovered at least 15 women appointed by Bibi Sahiba's grandsons who headed sizable Sufi orders. I'm going to stand up here because I'm rather excited about this. What's incredible is that they were strictly Orthodox, but half of their disciples were Hindus, most outside of the caste system. And all were visited and revered by the leading Orthodox Deobandi scholars and theologians of the region. It's a story that entirely breaks the mold and forces us to think outside. Next slide, please. The first of them, Dadi Mitta, a great saint of Umarkot with hundreds of thousands of devotees all the way to Rajasthan today, where you're actually going to find murtis of her for puja. She's a faqir, lives humbly in a thatched mud hut, visited by all the Deobandi scholars around, who sit under a tree and communicate with her through messengers or through a window. She's famous not only for her ghalba-e ruhani over Umarkot, but also for negotiating disputes and protecting the rights of peasants. I'll share a story, it's quite long, I'll try to compress it. In Talar, now in Rajasthan in India, there are dozens of villages who were Dadi Mitta's disciples. In one of these villages, a man called Babudan declares himself a landlord and starts extracting money from peasants. And then he starts harassing them with armed guards. So a delegation of tribes travels 200 kilometers to Umarkot to meet Dadi Mitta, and they ask her to intervene. She agrees to mediate and goes with a force of 250 men and women to negotiate with this rather villainous character, but he refuses and then he threatens the group. So what does she do? She refuses his water. These are fighting words. So she goes back and she organizes a defense force of 12 men and systematically plans an attack on Babudan's forces. They take him and they hang him upside down, and he's so humiliated by the event that he visits her and swears never to extort money from the poor again. This is one of several stories known by various tribes in the region. So this is incredible because here you have a traditional Orthodox woman of the 19th century in Thar, who in effect assembles vigilante forces of disciples to protect the poor. Now Dadi Mitta has 3 deputies, all of whom are incredible women in their own right, with their own spiritual following. Next slide, please. Her companion, Dadi Saleha Mangrio, who set up a madrasa in the latter 19th century. Everyone knows, and we have a first-hand account, that when her and her teacher met, they could bend time and space. They knew when they were supposed to meet. There was a young boy who used to accompany them, and they would meet in a designated location, have a piece of gourd, have a piece of bread, have some discussions, and then part ways. There was Dadi Khandal Halipoto, who dressed in men's clothes. She wore boots and a turban, performed impossible 40-day seclusion, and told her brother that he no longer has a responsibility to find a husband for her. Then we've got Dadi Gulaba Nehriyani, who would arrange for Dadi Mitha's tours of Rajasthan to meet with her and, to meet with and lecture to her disciples. Next slide, please. I should mention another of the Khalifas of Bibi Sahiba's great grandson, a man from Umarkot called Miu Jan Muhammad. He was a Malang. Actually, he was Neem Madzub. Madzub part of the time and not part of the time. He had long red hair and an orange coat and an ajrak. He was trained by his mother, who was a great Sufi, and then granted his spiritual authority to his daughter. Next slide, please. By Rahat, who was a well-respected wali by all the Deobandi Maulvis of Umarkot and Thar. By Rahat then passes her spiritual mantle to another woman who passes it on yet again to another. This, by the way, is by Rahat's doing. These are, and her daughters, these are the absolutely remarkable monuments they've created. Next slide, please. And these are her blessed slippers. Hundreds and hundreds of oral histories available of people who knew both of them. I would love to share if you're interested. The Imam of the Jami Masjid of Umarkot, who's a conservative Deobandi from Balochistan, from Las Bela, very good friend of mine, his father, Maulvi Abdur Rahman Jamali, was actually the head of the largest Deobandi madrasa in the region, and he's preserved a lot of the oral history of these great female saints. And by the way, I'm so glad Zebun Nisa was mentioned because he translated Zebun Nisa's poetry from Persian to Sindhi. And he's beloved by Muslims and Hindus of Umarkot for his insaniyat. I have literally, without exaggeration, met people in Umarkot Bazaar who have shed tears, Hindu merchants talking about his insaniyat. Now, as you can tell, the story can go on, but I'm going to start wrapping it up. Why were there so many female leaders in this part of the world? What was their social role? How is their authority established? What is going on here? These are the stories that I attempt to answer in my book. So to reiterate, why does all of this matter? First of all, these are stories that need to be told of an indigenous model of female leadership that exists within the moral framework of the region. And keep in mind, Kabul's moral framework is not the same as Tharparkar's, yet they can adapt. Second, next slide, please. Oh, I'm going to skip this one for the purposes of time, but next slide. Okay. The built environment and the hints in the literature point to many other contemporary women in leadership positions. For example, a Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Khanaqah right outside of Peshawar, which had the largest endowment in the entire Eastern Afghan Empire, 30,000 acres. This is led by someone called Mia Umar Chamkani, rahmatullah alayh, who actually, I'll finish up in 3 minutes, don't worry, who actually is the one who gave Ahmad Shah the go-ahead to take Hindustan. It's a very, very interesting story. He also teaches them several lessons along the way. This Khanaqah of 30,000 acres is actually led by 2 generations of women in the early 19th century, but we know virtually nothing about them. They're barely mentioned in the biographies. I had to go to Chamkani with my dear friends from there. We spent several days digging out manuscripts, as you can tell. That's a shajara. So the point here is that the narratives of Bibi Sahiba and her successors can actually provide context for those who are marginalized in our history. The point is she points to the existence of a significant world that has been erased. Next slide, please. Now, in the conclusion of my book, I present a fascinating, I can call it a polemical or a legal text, written in 2005. This is a follow-up text from '06 by a Sufi master from Bara in Khyber Agency. Many of you will know who this is. This is the Pir who has one of the biggest religious networks in Afghanistan. I visited 4 of their Khanaqahs in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan. Now the story is this: 3 women, Sufis from Lahore, wrote to him complaining that some people argued that women could not be Sufi masters. Keep in mind, Bara Khyber Agency. So he responded with a 20-page tract in Persian and Arabic, later translated into Urdu and Arabic, arguing that women's leadership is completely valid, and it ends with 3 pages of Bibi Sahiba's story as part of the evidence taken directly from her son's biography. So I will end the story here. Thank you very much for your patience. Do we have time for questions, or is this...
Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I just want to ask two questions. First is that how these female Sufis used to be in relation with the other Sufi
I'm
orders.
sorry, can you keep it a little bit further? I think you're
Okay.
having the same issue that I had. A little bit
Okay.
further from you, because
So
I'm
I
getting
just want to
feedback.
ask, is it audible now?
It's audible now.
Okay. So I just want to ask that, normally these female Sufis are used to be very rare. I'm hearing about this personality for the first time. Um, the idea is that how they used to, because it is also very hierarchical orders, and how these female Sufis used to be related to the other male companions, because they also would be like, there are different sets of orders, like at one stage, then they ascend to the next stage. So how these things happen. And the second question associated with it is that normally the saints have very miraculous stories. So, how the miraculous stories of a male Sufi was different to a female Sufi, or was there any difference? This is important. And the third thing is that
Would you
most of
mind if
the.
I stick to these two? Because both
Okay,
of these
yeah.
are like $1 million questions here, and I'm really happy that you asked them. So the first issue is this. We need to understand, just like the Ottoman court, just like the Mughal court, just like every institution in the pre-modern Muslim world, the Sufi center was structured as a household. It had its inner portion and its outer portion, the Batini and the Zahiri portions. So what ends up happening is this. So you've got, let's say, a male Sufi guide, and the male Sufi guide is training disciples. Now, communities are coming in families, right? So what invariably happens, and Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, by the way, has a huge role to play in this, because in fact, he's got a couple of letters to women where he argues that women have to be well versed in aqidah and doctrine and theology and fiqh in order to understand correct practice from incorrect practice, just as men need to understand correct from incorrect. So what ends up happening is the women within the Sufi household end up being trained and have access to all of the greatest scholars of the age. When this happens generation by generation, you start having a cadre of women who are now good enough to be able to train their own khulafa. Like, let's say, Sanaullah Panipati's wife is one of these very famous ones, the famous um, Mufassir of 18th century Delhi. And they develop their own circles who are all connected to the broader network. So, to quote a Peshawari Sufi sheikh who I talked to very recently, whose aunt was a great Sufi sheikh and whose wife is, I'm being told to stop now? Or may I continue? Um, I'll just complete this thought. So we need to understand that there are sort of worlds within worlds that are operating here, and unless we understand the physical structure of this space, and we don't look for authority just in visibility. That's one of the core issues that we are facing, that we assume that lack of visibility means lack of authority. What ends up happening is, because a lot of these are female-led, female-only spaces, that actually provides a safe space for then women to emerge as sheikhs in their own right, exemplified by the case of Bibi Sahiba. So we are still talking about patriarchal structures, entirely patriarchal Sufi structures, as you really well mentioned, but within that, remarkably, there is a space for these types of figures, and not just one or two, but I'm talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds to emerge. We just need to ask the right questions.